change between look-ahead lines and actual in-season lines. A lot of times there will be a pretty stark difference, but people throw around hot takes, they kind of bloviate, and when you actually see these point spreads, this is more an example of, okay, here's what the people who put their money where their mouth is. Here's what they think. Here are the people who stand to lose something if they're wrong. The average blowhard on the internet, if he or she gets something wrong, basically people forget 5 days from now, 5 minutes from now, maybe even 5 seconds from now. But if one of these sports, bookmakers, if he gets it wrong, if his point spread's not accurate, well, all of a sudden he stands to see his bottom line greatly impacted by that. So even if you don't bet on games, I'd say the establishing of the lines and the point spreads is still something that ought to get your attention, because it is a reflection of what a little bit deeper level of analysis says about the games for the upcoming season. With that in mind, we now have a few Georgia games now posted by FanDuel. We'll give those to you before we are done today. And if you're a UGA fan, it is a reminder of just how big of a favorite you are for the upcoming season. All right, a couple more comments. We'll get ready to get started. Randy Hall said, I see that Tech got a transfer quarterback from Clemson. I did see that. So Tech obviously has been on the receiving, or I should say, is it the giving end? Yeah, they've been on the giving end of the transfer portal. Obviously losing best player Jahmyr Gibbs, now on the receiving end, getting a quarterback here. So Tech fighting and scrapping and clawing, trying to have some sort of level of relevance for the upcoming season. Richard D's checking in. Good morning, national champion Dogs. Richard, that's always great to hear and great to see you checking in there on all of that. There's a very radical new law proposed in the state of California as it relates to NIL. Don't know that it'll be passed. It might. Don't know what impact it's going to have on college sports, but obviously it stands to have potentially a very big impact. And, we've talked about what Gene Smith, the Ohio State athletic director, has said, and others, Jim Phillips, the commissioner of the ACC, but a potential breakaway from, the current 130 teams that kind of make up what we think of as NCAA Division I FBS level college football, that the kinds of radical sort of discussions you hear coming from certain pockets of the country, I think can only serve to accelerate some of that discussion. And so we'll kind of get into what's out there on that before we're done today. Former Dog also has a new home, and it's relatively close to home, at least back in the SEC. So we'll tell you something about that here coming up, too. So it's a very busy show. Are we on the other platforms now? All right, so good morning to our friends at Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. Happy to be back in our friendly confines today, the DawgNation World Headquarters Studios. It's Connor Riley stopping by. It's reaction to some pretty big news yesterday with Marcus Washington Jr. reclassifying as a member of the 2022 class after originally obviously being a very highly rated 2023 commit. So we will talk about that. But off the top of the program today, on Friday, the great David Pollack, one of the all-time terrific Georgia Bulldogs in the history of this program, and also a very influential college football analyst, was on our show, and he said something about the Georgia defense for the upcoming season that was a little surprising to some. We'll talk about why. I'll share with you what some Georgia fans had to say about that, what it means for the Dogs for the upcoming year. What do you say we begin that way? Some really good Georgia football talk right here in the heart of the summertime. So let's do it right now. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. It's presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I'm always interested in what interests you. In other words, what's the stuff that we do here around DawgNation, particularly here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, that gets a reaction from you, that gets you talking, because ultimately that's what we, at least for me in this role as the host of this show, that's kind of how I see myself, as a little bit of a facilitator of a conversation. I've never been the kind of person, hopefully anyway, who has a big enough ego to think that everybody just sort of sits with, bated breath to hear what I have to say about things. Hopefully you're somewhat interested in my opinion. Otherwise, maybe you wouldn't tune in. But, this for me has always been about an ongoing conversation that Georgia football fans have together. I'm just lucky enough to be the one that speaks into the microphone and kind of facilitates that conversation. But your opinion has always mattered to me. What you think about Georgia football, things like that. That's always been kind of part of what we want to do around here, which is start a conversation, see what Georgia fans are kind of interested in and what kind of reaction you get, especially during this time of year. It has been commonly called talking season. Now, some people use that phrase negatively as, well, we're not really playing games, we're just talking about games. And to them, that seems like a bad thing. But to us, especially if you talk for a living, that seems like actually kind of a fun thing. And I think one of the ways in which we show our affection for sports in general, but in this case, college football specifically, is how we talk about it. In some cases, how we argue about it. But that passion that kind of develops in a conversation like this is just, this is what we do to pass the time. We go to the beach, we go to the pool, we do a lot of things during the summer, but we're kind of marking down and counting down those days to the start of the upcoming season, getting excited about that upcoming season. And we kind of pass that time by having a conversation about what our favorite team's going to look like, what the rivals are going to look like, what the rest of the landscape of the sport's going to look like. And I just like doing that this time of year. With that in mind, on Friday's show, we were really lucky in that we had David Pollack, great former Georgia Bulldog. Of course, we're going to be with David again coming up this upcoming Monday for his celebrity golf tournament there, which obviously supports the Pollack Family Foundation and Children's Healthcare of Atlanta and some great causes there. But we had Pollack on the show on Friday, and we were talking about the outlook for UGA for the upcoming season, particularly on defense. Now, I don't have to tell you this, but I'm going to say this for the more, less plugged-in version of the folks who might be tuning in today, is that Dave is one of the great defensive players, not just in the history of Georgia football, but in the history of college football in general. So what David says about the Georgia defense really matters because of how well he played as a defensive star going back to his time there at UGA. And obviously, David recognizes the historic nature of what Georgia did defensively along its way to winning a national championship a year ago. And I thought David offered a very realistic, very even-handed appraisal of what that might mean for Georgia on defense in 2022. And some of what David said, as I mentioned a moment ago, kind of really got some Georgia fans talking. So let me let you hear Pollack from Friday. If you missed it, you go back, check out Friday's edition of the show. There, around 45-minute mark or so, we had a great 10, 12-minute conversation with David Pollack. I think it was really good. So if you haven't yet listened to Friday's show, I hope you'll check that out. But let me give you a couple of pieces from that right now, in particular on Georgia bouncing back after having won the national championship, specifically on the defensive side of the football. This David Pollack from Friday.
You're not going to be the team you were. Look at the draft, BA. Like, you lost 15 guys.
Yeah.
I mean, you just lost a lot of talent. You can't replace that in 1 year. You can't hit that in one, recruiting class, in the last couple recruiting classes, for goodness sake. It's really special. But, the opening week against Oregon is going to be a tremendous challenge. And then if you look at the schedule, you're probably going to have some time where you can, build some depth, work on your defense. Your defense is never going to play ever at that level because it's the best front seven I've ever seen in my life covering the game or being around the game. But your defense will still be really good because of your DCs, because of Kirby, because of the recruiting. So I think that takes a step back, but I think the offense will be better than we've seen in a long time at Georgia. So you just keep doing what you're doing with the pieces that coach has brought in place, and I think you'll be successful.
So there's a certain level of realism there that I think for some Georgia fans was almost too realistic. It was one of those things where you hear David say that you are not going to be the team that you were. The way in which Georgia kind of defined itself last year, the way in which it was led by what David calls the best front seven he's ever seen, covering the sport, playing the sport, being a part of a great front seven himself. He says, you are not going to be what you were. You are never going to play at that level again. The historic nature of the Georgia 2021 defense, matching that in 2022, matching that in any year ever after this, might not quite be such an easy thing to do. That was David Pollack there on that. And then Pollack, in the midst of that, went into a little bit more specific detail about exactly what he thinks this means for Georgia for the upcoming season. He actually gave a little bit of a number around this, attached a number to his opinion. And once again, this is the kind of thing that kind of got Georgia fans certainly piqued their interest a bit. Here is David going into more detail about what he thinks all the departures from last year's team means for Georgia on defense for this upcoming year. Once again, David Pollack.
This defense is going to be at least 10 points a game worse than it was a year ago. Okay? That sounds horrible, Brandon. That sounds terrible. They'll still be in the top 30 in scoring defenses in the country. Like, they're still going to be really good, but you're going from historic good, historic great, 5 guys drafted in the first round. That doesn't even count Nakobe Dean. So, I mean, you're just talking about you're going from super special to something that's going to be different. But who's your leading stat guy? You got Beal back. You got Nolan Smith, who I think is your heartbeat. The best defensive player on that in the team is Jalen Carter to me. So he's coming back next year. So you've got a lot of pieces to be very successful. Yes, they're going to have to be aggressive. Yes, you're going to have to continue to get the quarterback, and that's something that group I think did prove they could do really, really well at a high level, which sets you apart from many defenses of Georgia's defensive past. But again, they're going to take a significant step back, but they're still going to be really solid.
So significant step back, David says, but still really solid, still among the very best in the country. And as I said before, well, Georgia fans thought David's words there were really pretty interesting, and they had their own opinion about that. I looked at a story at DawgNation.com. Our sometimes producer, Michael Carvel, kind of wrote up some of what David said there and put those quotes in print. And we put a story up on DawgNation.com about that, and Georgia fans had a chance to react in print to that. I want to read you a couple of statements from Georgia fans here, just going to give you an idea of how some of the audio you just heard from David landed with Georgia fans who read about this there at DawgNation.com. Let me show you the first one of these on the screen here for a moment. This comes from a commenter called Street123. He says, really on average, Kirby Smart's scoring defense in Georgia average about 16 points per game, which would rank as a top 10 defense every year. So he says, when you compare this upcoming season with the same period last year, you can see that media expectations are higher for this UGA defense than they were last season. Let me pause on that for a moment. It's important to note, as Street kind of says here, that for the historic way in which the Georgia team kind of finished the season and the way it'll be remembered, as Street says, that's not really what people were saying about that defense going into last season. I think he's probably right about that. He also says that last season, nobody projected Georgia to have 5 first-round players taken in the draft. He says, that's just not really kind of what Georgia's projected to do. He says, so in fact, right now, the media expectations are for a far more talented UGA defense this season they expected to field last season. I don't necessarily think that Street's necessarily wrong about that, but let me show you a couple of more here for a moment. Reactions to some of the audio you just heard from David Pollack. Dog On says, I believe this year's defense will allow not what David Pollack said of 10 more points per game, but 6 to 7 more points per game. He says, we got talented, high-caliber athletes playing defense this upcoming season. Thanks to Kirby's recruiting prowess, he says, doubt not. He says, go Dogs, and gives you GATA to go along with that. Similar sentiment being expressed by another commenter, and I'll show you this one here too. This one coming from JRMDVM1. He says, I tend to agree with David Pollack's analysis, except once again, I think the increase will only be about 6 or 7 points per game and not a full 10 points per game, the way that David Pollack said. He says, the commenter says, I've got some questions about last year's defensive stats that someone, that did data could probably answer. So he kind of goes on to ask some questions about that. He says, and as mentioned before, when your defense dominates, you don't need to score in the second half. Georgia's offense came through in the fourth quarter of the national championship game, while the defense shut down a very prolific offense. So commenter there also kind of weighing in with the idea that Georgia may give up more points per game in the upcoming season. But he says not 10 points per game, but more like 6 or 7 points per game. Now, it's important to note, and some other commenters in that list of comments that didn't have time to read, some of the other commenters who comment on the story pointed out something, that even though David sees an increase in the points per game allowed by the Georgia defense for the upcoming season, as David said, that still puts you in the category of the very best defense in the country for the upcoming season. But let's just say, for the sake of conversation right now, David is right. And let's say that Georgia averages about 10 more points per game this upcoming year than it did a year ago. What if Georgia's defense last year had done the same thing? What if Georgia had given up that many more points last year than it did? Do you know that if that was the case, that Georgia's end-of-season record would have almost been virtually identical, that The national championship game would have still had the same result. Georgia would have still won the game. The Orange Bowl, the college football playoff, would have had the same result. Georgia would have still won easily. Georgia lost the SEC championship game, so 10 more points wouldn't have mattered there. Georgia Tech lost 45-0. 10 points to them would have been a gift, but still a blowout. Same thing for Tennessee. 10 more points wouldn't have made that game very close. The Missouri game wouldn't have gotten that much closer. The Florida, final margin of victory would have been cut in half if you gave them 10 more points, but still a dominant blowout Georgia win. Same thing for the Kentucky game, 30-13, despite the fact that Vince Marrow, the Kentucky assistant, thinks they're just knocking on the door of a Georgia upset. You could have given them 10 more points a year ago. That still wouldn't have changed the result of the game. Same thing for Auburn. Same thing for Arkansas. Same thing for Vanderbilt. Same thing for South Carolina. The only game a year ago that 10 more points of the opposition would have meant the difference between winning and losing for UGA was the Clemson game at the beginning of the year, when if you give Clemson 10 more points there that day, they would have won the game. Georgia did not have an offensive touchdown there that day. Clemson didn't either. So 10 more points would have changed that result. Maybe that could have been the difference between winning the national championship a year ago, because obviously that out-of-conference loss would have certainly been a difficult thing to overcome from a perception standpoint. But the point here is Georgia played 15 games last season. 14 of those games would have had the exact same result, even if the opposition had scored 10 more points. It's an idea, and it's an example of just how dominant UGA was. So maybe I think the important takeaway here is 10 more points per game for Georgia defensively this year may not quite change the result of games quite as much as maybe you think. We're going to talk later on in the show about just how big of a favorite Georgia is in a lot of the high-profile games it's slated to play, and a little more defensive, a little bit more opposing offensive production yielded by a defense that might not quite be as historic as it was last year. Once again, I don't know that's necessarily anything for a Georgia fan to panic about necessarily. However, let me also say this. There is one thing that if I were to disagree with from David, that I might disagree with, and it's actually not his statistical projection for Georgia for the upcoming season. Maybe he's right about that. Maybe he's wrong. That's not necessarily something I have as strong an opinion on. But there is something that David said there that I do think he might be wrong about. Now, listen, David knows more about this than I do, both for having been close to it as a player and all the other reasons. However, there is one aspect of what David said there that I might choose to humbly disagree with. The notion that Georgia was so historically good last season that it will never be matched again. Now, I told you this after the NFL draft, that when you see guys like Trayvon Walker become the number one overall pick, when you see guys like Jordan Davis, Devontae Wyatt, in so many ways totally defying their draft projections, their projections as a recruit, what people thought was possible with them as a football player when they worked their way into the first round. When you see Georgia last year seemingly having so much fun, playing as an ensemble cast, getting a lot of guys paid, getting a lot of guys a lot of fame, making a lot of guys historically revered figures in college football. That's the kind of performance that also has an attractive quality to it, that great defensive players are themselves going to want to be validated by what Georgia did defensively. And I've told you before that eventually I think that Georgia will have an even better defense than it had in 2021. I'm not talking about these players in 2022. That's not what I'm talking about necessarily. We'll wait and find out how good they are. I'm saying sometime in the future. Maybe it's 2023, maybe it's 2025, maybe it's 2030. I don't know. But sometime in the future, the level of success that Georgia had in 2021, the way that it redefined what it means to play defensive football and redefined how you win a national championship in a modern age that we had become convinced was totally dominated by kind of a finesse style, offensive-minded, throw the ball around 100 times per game type of offense. Georgia redefined a lot of that last season. Defensive players, I believe, noticed that kind of thing. And I do truly believe that if Georgia was historically good last season, most people seem to think that it was, that's just the start of Georgia's defensive history. And eventually it's going to build something here that not just rivals what it did in 2021. I believe eventually it'll be even better because people want to be the next Trayvon Walker or the next Nakobe Dean or the next Jordan Davis, Devontae Wyatt, Lewis Seen, fill in the blank with whoever you want to fill it in with there. Guys want that same level of validation on the defense side of the ball. Georgia's become the place where that happens. So that's the future, I believe. That's the one thing that I might, I guess, kind of slightly disagree with what David said there on Friday. But his overall takeaway is this, and I think this is the part that most Georgia fans can probably kind of find common cause with. And even Kirby Smart himself has said this in a couple of the interviews that he's done over the course of the last week, that there is an identity that the Georgia team had in 2021 that won't quite be matched in 2022. Do I think that Georgia is still an elite defense, probably the best in the country for the upcoming season? I probably do. Statistically, will it be a carbon copy of what it was in 2021? No, probably not. Will the offense be a little bit better? And does Kirby Smart feel like they may be heading that direction? I believe probably so. We'll have more on that before we're done on the show today there as well. But ultimately, it's a slightly different makeup for UGA, chasing the same result. An undefeated regular season in the thick of the playoff conversation as you head towards December, and maybe even hoisting a national championship trophy. Even if this is not the historically good defense in 2022 that it was in 2021, don't kid yourself in thinking that's not a huge possibility. Greatness for Georgia can still be achieved this upcoming season, even if the recipe for that greatness looks a little bit different than it did a year ago. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Good morning to you, and thanks for being with us, no matter how you get to us today, whether you tune in 9:45 for First and 15 at DawgNation.com and on the DawgNation app, or you check in with us on video after that, live, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, or the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we are available as a podcast wherever you find them, the Apple Player, Spotify, the Google Player for those of you on the Android devices. We post the show at the world-famous DawgNation.com. We try to make the show as available on as many different platforms as possible. We certainly appreciate you tuning in and having fun with us on all of that. And by the way, we also appreciate our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia there as well. Listen, I get to sit in a comfortable studio. I get to talk to you using all kinds of technology that I don't understand. We get a chance to deliver this show each and every day because proud partners help us do that. And I am so thankful for those who've been with us for a long time. And we are good friends, deep relationship with Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And they don't just feel that way about us. They're proud partners of UGA there as well. They love doing business with the dogs, and they love doing business with folks like you who support the dogs. And that's why I am so proud to tell their story on this show each and every week. So make sure you check out my friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia for your foundation, your waterproofing issues. We've had some rain this spring, going to have more. That's just kind of the nature of this time of year. And rain, for some of you, brings a little extra anxiety because you see that water creeping in where it's not supposed to be. Basement, crawl space, garage, in some cases. Those water puddles show up, or you see those wet spots. There's an example of some evidence that some water at one point in time was there where it's not quite supposed to be. Well, listen, that's where Engineered Solutions of Georgia can step in for you. Same thing for those cracks in the walls. When you see that, deep down, you sort of know that's not what's supposed to be there, and you sort of have a hint, a little bit of a suspicion that might be something of a problem. Well, Engineered Solutions of Georgia can tell you how big of a problem it is. Sometimes it's not a big fix. Sometimes it's like go to the hardware store and buy whatever. I don't even know what. Sometimes it's a small thing like that. But if it's not, if it's something more substantial, and they'll tell you the difference. If it's something a little bit more substantial than that, you want ESOG on your side because they have 2 full-time engineers on staff, smart people who know how all of this kind of stuff impacts the structural integrity of your home, taking care of your most important asset from an investment standpoint, from an emotional standpoint. It's obviously really important. That's what Engineered Solutions of Georgia allows you to do. So make sure you reach out to them. Number could not be easier to remember. Simply dial 678-ESOG now. That's 678-ESOG now. That'll get you in touch with Engineered Solutions of Georgia. All right, we're going to get Connor Riley here in just a moment. Before that, I want to go around the doghouse. And this is one of those times in like sort of our lives as college football fans where it just sort of seems like anything is possible, right? I mean, we have so many different kinds of news stories that bubble up. And, you know, I think those of us who are fans, or in my case, someone who works speaking to fans on a daily basis, we just sort of have to be ready for anything at all times. And sometimes it's not so great news. Other times it actually really is very good news. An example of the latter here right now, yesterday on social media, Marcus Washington Jr., Georgia defensive back commit for the class of 2023, top 100, player in the country, top 10 defensive back type guy. This is a very big deal, big time prospect for the 2023 class, but now he is reclassifying to the 2022 class. He had just taken an official visit to Athens a little early, kind of mid-May for an official visit for a player of that caliber, but now you understand maybe why that was, because he is now kind of moving into that class of 2022 for Georgia. Also, when you add Washington, and we talked about this last week, when you look at the Slim Singletaries and the Dalen Everetts and the Julian Humphreys, obviously Malachi Starks at the safety position, you start now adding a Marcus Washington Jr. into all of that it's not crazy to say that the defensive back haul for Georgia in the class of 2022 is historically good. It'd be easy for someone like me to say the greatest of all time. And, frankly, I don't have every defensive back class of all time, certainly committed to full memory here. But that many elite type prospects, that many 5 stars, that many top 100 type guys, adding Washington into that discussion, boy, you got to imagine it's in a pretty historic category. You have to assume that it probably is. Obviously, a lot of folks also know that Marcus' father played at UGA, so we're talking about a guy that understands the value of the Silver Britches, the value of the Georgia program all the way around. And this is a little bit of an alleviation for something that Kirby Smart said was a concern for him, which was a lack of depth, just total numbers when it involves defensive backs, that Kirby felt like they needed more. And to bring in a guy like this, you certainly get a chance to do that. We've talked about reclassified guys before. I think there's something to be said for a defensive back reclassifying as opposed to like a bigger guy that's playing the front 7 or along the line of scrimmage. I think big guys against other big guys, I think a little bit of age probably helps you. Could a guy like Washington be more ready as a defensive back? I think probably so. Now, maybe that's just my own ignorance speaking there. Maybe that's not quite as easy as I'm treating it to be. But to me, the transition for a player who relies on speed and quickness is a little bit easier for a younger guy than someone who's going to rely on that size and strength. I just think it's a little bit easier to talk about a reclassified defensive back than maybe a player from another position. I'll also tell you this. I don't think Georgia's doing this kind of thing unless they thought he had a chance to help out. In other words, they didn't bring him in a year early. I mean, Kirby Smart loves high school football. They didn't bring him in a year early. They didn't take him away from his senior year simply so he could be a project player and sit on the end of the bench and, watch and learn. That if they're taking this right now as a reclassified 2022 player, I think the automatic assumption you should probably have is that Georgia thinks this is a player capable of potentially helping them out, certainly being a factor in what we expect to be an intense competition for playing time. So this is a fascinating story. It's the kind of thing we've just kind of come to expect that, hey, Georgia's going to do anything it can to add talent to its roster, even at a time in which the average person's like, wait, does Georgia have 319 people on scholarship? That this is just kind of the way it goes. That Kirby's not looking to get below a number. Kirby's looking to get full use out of the available number that he has. Reclassified elite talent, an example of that. So, interesting addition here to the class of 2022. You can read more about this at the pages of DawgNation.com. And in fact, we'll keep this conversation going with Connor Riley here coming up there as well. In addition to that, some of the other stuff, Kirby Smart actually made 2 different interview appearances last week. I thought he said some interesting things in both of those discussions. So, there's actually a little bit going on here right now with Georgia football in terms of adding players to the roster, but also looking ahead to the start of summer practices, which will be here before you know it. June, also a busy time for recruiting there too. So what do you say we cover all of that right now and a lot more? It's a Kroger Fresh Take here with Connor Riley. Glad to have him and all of you with us in the program today.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Good morning to Connor Riley hanging out with us here today. As we said before, kind of a lot going on with Georgia here right now, so we'll cover a lot of that with Connor here for the moment. Connor, you heard me just share a little bit of brief thoughts here on the Washington thing. I'm not always in favor of reclassification, to be honest with you. I mean, there's a part of me that thinks age probably matters. And listen, I also think that high school is probably a pretty good experience, that I don't think you should be in too big of a hurry to move on from that stage of your life. College is always going to be waiting for you. But, listen, I don't think that Georgia would be looking to bring him in right now. They didn't think he had a chance to really help them and be a part of a competition for playing time or whatever else. What did you think specifically about the addition here to the 2022 class from a guy that would really stood out as one of the top prospects in the 2023 class?
Yeah, so we know Georgia's wanted to add to its defensive back room in terms of just the available bodies back there. They only had 4 scholarship cornerbacks with them during spring practice, and I think that did limit necessarily what they were able to do there. And so you go out, you add another top 100 overall type prospect in Marcus Washington Jr., a guy who has been committed to Georgia for a while. I believe he was technically their first 2023 commitment, if memory serves me correctly there. And he's a guy who, again, I think as you point out, he wouldn't be here if Georgia didn't think that he could help them in some meaningful fashion early on in his career at Georgia. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other talent coming in this summer with Julian Humphrey out of Texas and Jaheim Singletary out of Jacksonville. So I'm going to be interested to see how those 4 defensive backs, when I'm including Dalen Everett there as well, who's already enrolled and went through spring practice, sort of sort themselves out in that cornerback room, because that's a lot of cornerbacks to bring in at one point in time. But I also think it pretty clearly shows Georgia knows they have further to go to address some of the concerns in their secondary. I wonder if Georgia feels compelled to move any of those guys to that safety position, because I do sort of think safety is the bigger issue as it stands right now with where things are with Georgia in terms of their defensive back room. But again, this defensive backfield was so thin this spring. It was so obvious just watching them in spring practice. Getting an extra body with a guy who has great size, 6'1", I think 180 pounds and runs, in the 10s in terms of 100-meter dash times. I think that's something that every team in America would sign up for to get. The fact that you're getting him at this point in the cycle seems like a positive for Georgia.
Georgia now from taking defensive back in the transfer portal.
The only reason I'd be compelled to say yes to the fact that they may not take a player from the transfer portal is just I need to know more about, and we'll never get the answer to this, obviously, how are they going about counting the scholarship? Because if, theoretically he blue shirts and they count him as a summer arrivee and start him on scholarship August 1st, it sort of allows Georgia to keep its sort of scholarship numbers the same, and you could still possibly add there. I would add as well that, okay, let's say they do take Washington and that adds some more depth to the defensive backfield room. We know Georgia still, I think, wants to take a wide receiver provided the right one is in there. And so now does it come down to, all right, they've looked at who's in the transfer portal, who's become available. They think wide receiver is necessarily a bigger need than safety and felt, all right, hey, Marcus Washington's in a spot where he can come enroll early. And when I say enroll early, we obviously mean a full year early there and help us in that way and know that while we may not have the experienced player that we want to have, we know we're having a guy who's going to develop over the course of the season and possibly be ready, or someone else in that room be ready by the end of the year, where I think we all know, as sort of David Pollack touched on, this defense is going to be, the defense is going to be a work in progress over the course of the year. And so it's okay that you don't have a ready-made player week 1.
Point for a moment. Last year, Georgia takes Darian Kendrick. That's an all-ACC type guy from Clemson. It's an example of what Georgia thought that it needed. So maybe if you're a Georgia fan, this is great news. Georgia doesn't really feel like it needs an experienced Darian Kendrick anymore. So therefore, it's happy kind of bringing in an inexperienced talent because it's comfortable enough with everything else it has in the program. Or on the flip side of that, maybe Georgia went out and tried to find its 2022 version of Darian Kendrick and couldn't. Either that player was in the portal or Georgia couldn't get him or whatever else. And so therefore was, I hate to say forced to add another talented but young player at a position where we're kind of led to believe that experience really matters. You've got the very positive assessment of this of Georgia feels like even though the numbers are small, the talent's enough that it doesn't really need the Kendrick-style experience. Or the flip side of that, which is they tried that, they went shopping, shelves were barren. It was like the baby formula of recruiting, and now adding another young, inexperienced player. Which of those two sides of the coin do you think more likely to be accurate? The more positive assessment, or maybe the more, negative assessment?
I would say the more realistic assessment. If there are a Darian Kendrick type player in the transfer portal at that cornerback position, Georgia, we would have known about him. We would have known who that is. It's not a guessing game with who that guy might have been. And the reality is, Darian Kendrick was an all-SEC cornerback last year and showed up, 2 interceptions in the Orange Bowl. I don't believe there was that sort of player out there, either at that cornerback position or at that safety position. And so I guess if I have to classify that as a negative, I will do so. But I think that speaks to the larger sort of aversion that maybe Kirby Smart has to the transfer portal and relying on it in terms of, hey, yeah, we know we're going to have some holes, but we know we're going to be able to fill them in the transfer portal. Because the reality is there isn't that Darian Kendrick or even say Tyke Smith type player in the transfer portal right now, where an all conference player at another school, specifically a bigger school, that you feel like can come in, fit this Georgia team and help them get over the hump. The reality is that's not going to be available readily on a year in, year out basis. That's why when Amarius Mims went into the portal, it was such a big deal for schools like Florida State and Miami, because players of that caliber just so often don't make it in there. And so I guess I would have to say that, sure, it is more, I believe Georgia could not find a player of that caliber, but I think it speaks to the larger reality that there just aren't that often Darian Kendricks that enter the portal and then go on to have the success that they had at Georgia in their one season there.
Let me give you an example of something I think is kind of interesting. So we have heard rumors of Georgia being connected to a couple of different players in the transfer portal thus far this offseason, and for the most part, it hasn't materialized into anything. But there are other players who've gone in the portal that you might think, hey, maybe that player does make some sense for Georgia. And we never heard one rumor, not one time, not from anybody on social media. And by the way, it doesn't take much to get a rumor on going on social media when it comes to Georgia Twitter here. Like, I'll give you an example, like Legend Cavazos, a player that Georgia recruited out of high school from Ohio State. He goes in the transfer portal. You never heard one word about Georgia trying to get back involved with a player that seemingly it was kind of involved with as a high school guy, a couple of years ago, that if you wanted to have a positive assessment of that, even though Georgia is inexperienced in some cases, and even though maybe Georgia doesn't have quite the numbers that maybe Kirby Smart wishes they have in terms of being able to be impactful with the guys that will be on the field, maybe there is a little bit of an assessment that, that maybe Georgia likes its situation back there more than maybe some people think maybe it does.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to trusting their development. Legend Cavazos is a great example. If he were the guy I think Georgia or people thought he was as a recruit, he'd probably still be at Ohio State. And so if you're Georgia, why take somebody else's scrap heaps or a guy that wasn't necessarily playing there and adding him to his own depth when you've shown, even at that cornerback position, you can develop really well there, especially across that entire defense. You've developed 3-star and low 4-stars like Jordan Davis and Devontae White in the first-round picks. Eric Stokes became a first-round pick. DeAndre Baker became a first-round pick through his playing time at the University of Georgia. You've shown you can develop there, so why not trust that development once again? And while, yes, you might have some growing pains early on, I think over the course of time and even the course of a season, by the end of the year, I think all of us would agree, whoever ends up winning that other cornerback job opposite Keely Ringo, you're probably going to feel pretty good in what you have in there, because between Kamari Lassiter, Nyland Green, Dalen Everett, perhaps even Marcus Washington Jr., there's too much talent there, and there's too much know-how on that defensive side of the ball. Even now with Will Muschamp working as a co-defensive coordinator in the secondary, there's too much know-how for them not to figure it out there. And I think Georgia has now earned the benefit of the doubt to be given that leeway in terms of finding quality defensive back play, even if it might mean some instability at the beginning of the year.
Do you think that Georgia will average 10 more points per game defensively the way that David Pollack said they will?
10, it's right around there. I could see 7 to 10. And yeah, I went back and checked the math. Since 2017, when Georgia really got things rolling under Kirby Smart, they've only given up 20 points a game once in his tenure, and that was actually ironically in 2020 when you had probably all that talent you had in the 2011 and the 2021 team, along with the secondary in that 2020 season. So I could certainly see 10 points a game, and at the same point in time, going back and checking the math, all right, 10 points, they're giving up 20 a game. That's still a top 15 scoring defense pretty consistently over the past 5-6 years there. So you're still, even if that ends up being the case, if it's only 7 points a game, as some people have said, that's still a top 10 scoring defense. And so while, yes, you're going to see some regression, you're still also going to see probably one of the better defenses. And it would not surprise me in the least if, this group is able to stay healthy over the course of the season. Come late November, December, this might be a defense that we're talking about is clearly one of the best 5 in the country, improved week over week over the course of the season. I think if they can get through that first month of the year where they have Oregon and South Carolina away from home, I think you're going to see this defense really put things together. Now, the November slate, home against Tennessee, at Mississippi State, back-to-back. Those are tough offenses to play at that point in the year. And I'm going to be really interested to see how they sort of go about attacking those offenses, because they were so unique from, I think, what Georgia is going to see more often than not. But by the end of the year, sure, Georgia might be giving up 18 points a game. But if you give me, what we see on the field in the month of November, it also wouldn't surprise me if Georgia is a top 5 defense in the country once again.
Yeah, it's funny. Georgia top scoring defense in the country last year at 10.2 points per game. If you gave them 10 more than that, ironically, it puts you like 19th best in the country where Alabama was. You're talking about, being an Alabama-level defense at 10 more points per game. But this is where, like, small differences make a big distinction. That if what you said could be true, let's say that Georgia's not giving up 10 more points per game. Let's say it's only a touchdown more per game. That puts you right there in the category of what Penn State was defensive a year ago, what Cincinnati was defensive a year ago, what Michigan, Oklahoma State, Baylor were a year ago. The Big 12 actually played better defense last year than some folks kind of realize. Baylor, Oklahoma State, kind of an example of that. That if you could be a touchdown worse, not 10 points worse, all of a sudden you are still in that category of what was like a top 10 level defense a year ago. And that's terrible news for Georgia's opponents. If Georgia's still playing sort of top 10 nationally, from a defensive perspective, then Georgia ain't going anywhere. Bad grammar, intentional. Georgia ain't going anywhere in terms of the national championship conversation. But as I said before, that extra field goal per game could matter. 10 more points would have lost you the Clemson game, whereas an extra touchdown there would have still given you a chance to maybe win that game. So I think there's a big difference here in, hey, it's an extra touchdown per game versus what David said of an extra 10 points per game. David may be right, but if Georgia could keep it below that number, that could really be the recipe for something pretty interesting.
Right, and we've touched on this, and even David touched on it there as well. If this offense does what we think it's capable of, it might not matter a whole lot how significantly this defense falls off, statistically speaking, anyway. Because while yes, sure, people want more production out of the offense a year ago. I think it's fair to say, just given the way Georgia played so often in the second half, and you can say, oh, why aren't we scoring more points, putting up more yards, putting up more stats? I mean, preserving your guys' health proved to be pretty important come the end of the year when Alabama just wasn't healthy because they were having to score so often late in games to win comfortably. Come the end of the year, Georgia's skill players were finally healthy. And if Georgia does get that health luck, I don't think they're going to have a problem averaging 42 points a game this season. That's the number you've thrown out before, sort of the one you want to see Georgia hit. And so if Georgia's winning more games next year, 42-24 than, say, 34-10, I think Georgia's still going to be just fine and in a pretty similar spot to where they found themselves a year ago, entering the SEC championship game, possibly with an unbeaten record or an 11-1 record there. And if you're in that spot, you're very clearly in the college football playoff discussion.
First, remind you, this is our Kroger Fresh Take with Connor Riley here on the program here today. And, of course, Kroger has got a great new opportunity for you. It's a membership opportunity. It's called Kroger Boost. Now, listen, the Kroger Boost membership program gives you a chance to take advantage of some great things that Kroger's well known for. You love the fuel points there at Kroger, the fuel savings you get because of that. How about double the fuel points as a member of Kroger Boost? Also, the idea of free grocery delivery, many more great incentives there as well. In fact, membership starts as low as $59 for the year. So find out for yourself all the great incentives coming your way for being a member of Kroger Boost. So go to Kroger.com/boost for more on this. That's Kroger.com/boost. So, Connor, since you mentioned the Georgia offense, I want to talk to you about that here for a moment because Kirby Smart last week participated in 2 interviews. He was with Cole Kubelik on the radio program there in Birmingham before teeing off in the celebrity event. He was on the Feinbaum show, kind of connected to the same type of deal last week there too. In both those interviews, I came away getting the sense, especially from the Kubelik interview, Kirby's pretty competent right now in his offense, I believe. And I've played the audio. I've kind of made my case on that. I know you've written about these quotes there yourself. I think that Kirby sounds pretty optimistic about what he brings on offense. There was one line in particular where he talked about, hey, we feel like we have 3 or 4 good receivers or something along those lines where this wasn't the woe is me thing of, we got to try to find somebody who can play. No, it sort of sounds like that he sees growth and development from that position group. And we know that Georgia's dominated by tight ends and Georgia's still going to be running back university and getting those guys involved. But I hear a little bit of confidence from Kirby when I hear him talking about that offense, and it's the kind of thing that I don't think fans should miss, because I don't think Kirby would say it if he didn't mean it.
Yeah, and I think to even hone in on the point you're making there, I think it's directly tied to that wide receiver position in terms of what Georgia has, because the big question there, as we sort of talked about, it's not talent. I believe that wide receiver room showed pretty well on G-Day that if those guys are healthy, Arian Smith is going to make plays. That we've never had any doubt about that. He just has not been able to get on the field to make plays consistently enough. I thought from expectation-wise, I don't know if a player had a better day than Kearis Jackson did on G-Day. He looked fast. He showed a really impressive burst. And, everyone says, oh, can he get back to who he was in 2020? Well, we talked about it with him afterwards. I think there's a real good chance he's even better than he was a year ago if he's able to maintain that sort of speed that he showed off there. Obviously, we all know Dominic Blaylock, if he's on the field, he has the potential to be a very important playmaker there. And even Marcus Rosemy-Jacksain, a guy who might get lost in the weeds by some, he has a very unique skill set that is going to help this offense at some point in time, where Stetson's just going to have to force a ball in there, and Marcus is going to be able to win one of those 50-50 balls. And we mentioned those four names there. Didn't mention A.D. Mitchell, didn't mention Ladd McConkey there. So you've got at least 6 guys right there that if they're all healthy, that's a really solid wide receiver rotation you have there to go along with what you have at tight end, which is probably not only maybe the best tight end room in the country, maybe the best position group in the country in terms of what you have going 4 or 5 deep there. And then the running backs, I really like what Georgia has in Kendall Milton and Kenny McIntosh, and provided they're able to stay healthy, I think there's a dynamic there that even makes them maybe a little bit better, and maybe makes this offense a little bit better than it was under Zamir White and James Cook, because with White and Cook, you sort of knew what to expect based on who was in there. I think with what we've seen from Milton and McIntosh, Georgia can be more versatile with both of them because their skill sets are a little bit more interchangeable, and that makes you even more unpredictable in terms of what opposing defenses are going to be able to key in on there. So if Georgia's healthy in the wide receiver room, I think these recent comments by Kirby Smart indicate he really likes the talent that they have surrounding Stetson Bennett in this offense. We didn't even touch on the offensive line there either.
Yeah, I remember myself last year going to the Clemson game as a fan, really pretty nervous about that big game, really feeling like that Georgia was going to pull out all stops to win it. The actual game ended up being a little bit different than I thought it was going to be, but going into the game, I remember thinking, man, I want tight ends in the field, I want running backs in the field. Those are Georgia's best position groups. In the absence of George Pickens, as many backs and as many tight ends as you can get. As you said, Georgia's still going to be really deep at those positions, cartoonishly deep at the tight end position, it would seem. But all of a sudden, this is not one of those things, I believe, where Georgia's playing a bunch of tight ends because it has to, or playing a bunch of running backs because they don't really have wide receivers that it wants to play. That Georgia may still lean into like the multiple tight end situation. It obviously probably will. But if it wants to showcase receivers more, based on some of the stuff that Smart said last week, stuff we've played here on the program, I get the sense that Georgia thinks it can play that way now too, which is a step forward for Georgia offensively compared to where it's been in the past.
Right, and even going into that wide receiver room, all right, Arian Smith, and I'll throw C.J. Smith in there as well. Those are your speed guys. Those are the guys you're going to have. And Ladd McConkey deserves mention there as well, because I think he is, I don't want to use the cliche deceptively fast, but he is a guy who can make big plays, taking the top off the defense there. You have those sort of guys who cannot operate over the middle of the field and separate from tight coverage. Kearis Jackson, Dominic Blaylock. You have guys who can win balls on the outside, and A.D. Mitchell and Marcus Rosemy-Jacksain. You have a lot of different skill sets in that wide receiver room without even getting into the running backs and the tight ends, who we know are obviously going to be an important part of this passing offense. You have a variety of players that, as pass catchers, can win in a multitude of ways. And when you have an offensive coordinator as good as what he does, as Todd Monken is, I think that's going to make things very, very difficult for opposing teams to key in on, in a way that, Alabama last year with Mechie and Williams, Williams was going to try and stretch you deep, and Mechie was going to operate the underneath. And then when you lose one of them, I think that really impacts what you do. I think Georgia now is better positioned this year. If they lose maybe one or two guys to injury, which is just going to happen because it's the nature of a violent game of football, you're still going to be okay enough offensively because you have enough different ways to attack an opposing defense under your employment.
Connor, terrific stuff. Thank you for being here as part of our Kirker Fresh Take here today. You've had some great stuff online there, DawgNation.com there as well. I continually encourage folks to read everything that you're putting out there, and we will also look forward to speaking to you here on our program again very soon as well.
Yep, as as always, was a pleasure. Yeah.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, so fun to think about, and we're in the midst of it. This is not, we've kind of transitioned from the way too early top 25 to now they're just preseason top 25s. And the sort of, hey, crazy way out, in the future somewhere, Georgia's going to play a 2022 season to all of a sudden it's not quite so far out into the future anymore. We're halfway done with the calendar year. We are rolling into the summer. The month of June is going to be incredibly busy from a recruiting standpoint. Then after that, the 2022 season is basically here. So how does Georgia fill in these spots? How does Georgia create its identity, its story for the upcoming season? We are in the midst of figuring all that out right now. And a couple of different interviews last week. Smart gave you some insight on that. We played that audio for you on shows. So if you've missed some recent episodes of DawgNation Daily, go back into the back catalog, if you will, whether it be on YouTube or on the podcast or wherever else. Go back and listen to what you missed. Really, really good stuff from Kirby, laying the foundation for what the 2022 Georgia team is going to be. We've got some SEC news to give you there as well. But first, let me remind you that we're cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, and you should be doing the same thing yourself. Cruising around with Royal Caribbean here this summer, getting on board one of those great Royal Caribbean cruise ships, whether it's a 3-4 night type deal, going to the Bahamas, maybe leaving out of Port Canaveral. That's the port that we sailed out of back in April. It's a short drive from where I am right now in the Atlanta area, just past Orlando. It's really easy to get to. You can go on one of those. So many of those itineraries include Perfect Day Coco Cay. That's the private island right there in the Bahamas. And when people hear me talking about Royal Caribbean, that's probably the thing that people mention to me more than anything else. Either they've been, they love it, or they've heard me talk about it and they want to be a part of it there as well. There's really nothing like it that I've ever done, and I just can't wait to be back there again. The island itself kind of divided into two areas. You've got the thrill side and the chill side. The thrill side is like a gigantic water park. I mean, it's really amazing. It's like this oasis, like this water park, like right in the middle of the ocean. Tallest water slide in North America. You've got the largest, like wave pool type deal in the Bahamas. But there's also like the chill side there as well, where you have the floating cabanas. You have this, huge freshwater pool. Everybody's just kind of hanging out, relaxing, and enjoying themselves. And obviously the beach, the pristine waters. I mean, the quality of the water in the Bahamas just blows you away. You can see all the way to the bottom. It's amazing. There's great snorkeling opportunities. Just a really fun experience. So make sure you get ready to go on that yourself. Our friends at the Cruise and Vacation Authority can help you get booked up on that, tcava.com. That's the website, tcava.com. Or give them a call, 770-952-8300. That's 770-952-8300. All right, let's do some cruising on the SEC stuff. So we have the television network for Alabama, Texas. That's September 10th in Austin. It's going to be on Fox. This has led everybody to assume, and I think rightly so, the game is going to be, as Fox likes to call it, their big noon kickoff. It's kind of a weird thing where, most of us kind of hate the early starts. Certainly a lot of Georgia fans feel like they've had way too many noon starts, especially last year in the national championship season. Georgia played a ton on noon. A lot of fans don't like that. But TV audiences love it. Fox gets, and I know you don't care about like the business side of this and TV ratings, but you should know, Fox gets gigantic ratings for big noon kickoff. Their noon kickoff games, they get huge television ratings for those. One of the reasons why ESPN's kind of reconfigured some of its stuff. Honestly, part of the reason why Georgia probably played on noon as much as it did a year ago, think about Arkansas, think about things like that, was because of how well the Fox games are doing over there. It's one of those things where Fox is kind of eaten into ESPN's college football monopoly with its success with the noon kickoff. So Bama, Texas, probably going to be played there, as a lot of folks were saying online yesterday. It will be 9 million degrees. There's no doubt about that. But there's also an element of this game that's a little bit different for Alabama than it's been. How many years in a row, and I guess I didn't fully realize this till yesterday, how many years in a row have we seen Alabama neutral site, week one, non-conference opponent, and they are just absolutely annihilating their competition? This has happened week one. It's the biggest sure thing in all of sports, and you've heard me say this before. It's the biggest sure thing in all of sports. What Alabama has done to a non-conference opponent in a neutral site venue week one to start the year, their record against the spread is infinity. They have just done that over and over again. But this year, it's not like that. This year, it's cupcake week one on the road, true road game in Austin after that. Does the difference in environment make a difference for Alabama? Is this the same kind of early September, kind of blowout type deal we've come to expect from Alabama, or is it something different? Because keep in mind this, while we've seen Alabama dominate the non-conference opponent week 1, there's also that kind of mid-September lull that Bama has taken more than once. Remember last year at Florida? Think about how weird that is in retrospect, that Bama really did not play well in Gainesville, was in some respects almost lucky to even win the game. That we've seen Alabama be great every year week 1, and then at times kind of take a little bit of a dip after that. A couple of losses to Ole Miss, if you want to go back 2014, 2015, some other examples of that kind of in between, where they are not always great mid-September, but almost always essentially virtually perfect to begin the year. So how does that track record matter going to Texas here this year? And obviously, you know what's on the line for Texas. They just need something to be relevant. They just need something to prove they're a part of the college football conversation. Obviously, Arch Manning, unless he has made his decision to commit prior to that, the assumption is that he's going to be watching that closely. He's told some media outlets that he's curious to see what Texas can do on the field after being, not very good a year ago. He's clearly, trying to get back and to get involved, to see what Texas can do there in that regard. But this is a fascinating early season game here. Texas getting a chance to host a big timer out of the SEC, prove that it's relevant, and Alabama in a slightly different circumstance than we've seen its big non-conference game in the past. So I think that's potentially a lot of fun. A couple of high-profile receivers have landed in the SEC here, and one of these is a name that you'd seen some online chatter about regarding Georgia. Jalen Robinson, former UCF wide receiver, playing down there with Gus Malzahn. He is moving on. He's going to land at Ole Miss. This is a program, obviously, Ole Miss. I mean, they've even made the T-shirts transfer to the SIP and things like that. They've clearly built a large level of their branding around being aggressive in the transfer portal, and Jackson Dart and Zach Evans and others, an example of them succeeding in that regard. So Robinson, I guess the latest example of that, on his way to Ole Miss. And then Matt Landers, of course, you know him as former Georgia receiver after having been at, was it Toledo? Is that where Landers was? Toledo? Yeah, he was a Rocket in Toledo, and now he's back playing for Sam Pittman again, this time with the Arkansas Razorbacks there. So from that standpoint, a couple of high-profile transfer receivers landing here in the SEC. And then finally, let me give you this here for a moment. So there is a big new proposed law in California. Now, when I say stuff like this, it's always very confusing to know what's actually going on here. So this is a state law in California that's been proposed. A legislator has brought this up for discussion. It's not currently law, but it's being discussed and proposed. I'm going to read this to you from the Los Angeles Times, obviously one of the most recognized news entities in the world. This is the headline. You think that NIL blew up college sports? The headline asks. Well, this California bill is going to actually make sure I read this correctly. Well, California is going for the knockout with a new bill. So this is the way that the LA Times positions this. The new law being proposed in California would be a knockout for college sports. Now, I think some of you know I'm a little bit skeptical of some of the NIL transfer portal stuff that we're living with. And I think you would expect maybe a level of like sort of fatalistic language from someone like me who's just not quite so sure that all these new changes are good for college sports. It's important to note, this is not my language, though. This is the language of a presumably neutral observer of the LA Times saying that California is going for a knockout of college sports with a new bill. Let me ask you this question, and maybe you do. This is not a rhetorical question. I mean this literally. Do you want college sports to be knocked out, eliminated? Do you want that to go away? Because that's what the LA Times says in pretty, sensationalistic type language here that some folks in California want to do. Now, well, here's what the law specifically would allow for. It would allow for revenue in football, men's basketball, women's basketball to be split 50-50 between the athletic department and the players that play in those sports. And in one respect, that seems to some people probably like a good thing. I want to be fair that a lot of people believe that's probably maybe a good thing in some regards. Clearly there's some thought here that the future of football is going to include some sort of payout from these very high, in many cases, billion-dollar TV contracts for the players themselves. But if you don't see how a discussion like this could eventually result in all kinds of unintended consequences, then to me, you're just trying to be willfully ignorant. You forget the fact that, I mean, in the case of women's basketball, in many cases, there really is no true revenue to speak of. The sport is funded by football. The TV contract, to the extent that it even exists for women's basketball, is kind of clustered together through ESPN with a bunch of other sports, there as well. You can't give out the same dollars twice. Like, in other words, the football dollars are coming in. You can't pay the football players with that and then turn around and fund all the other sports to the same degree you've kind of funded in the past. And so this kind of thing, just at face value, would seem to be the elimination of some sports at some athletic departments, or in some cases, athletic departments in general, because they either can't or just don't want to be a part of this. So I don't know where all of this lands and where all this is going, and how a proposed law in California could eventually impact, everything else in college athletics. But I do know this. I'm on the side of not blowing up college sports, whatever that is. I'm on the side of not blowing it up, because honestly, I see players whose lives have been changed for the better for their participation in college sports. I see people who've built a career in all of this, who've gotten better, and gone on to great success because of the way in which they've been filtered through college athletics, the way in which that's been, a force for good in their lives. And frankly, I don't want to blow that up. But some people apparently do. So we'll see how that changes in the future. And we'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Let me get back to the subject of football here for a moment. And we talked off the top of the program about Georgia for the upcoming year. And we talked about how, listen, if you want to go back and look at Georgia a year ago, David Pollack on Friday's show suggested, hey, maybe Georgia gives up 10 more points per game this year than it did a year ago. We saw at the top of the program is, well, Georgia blew out its opponents so much last year that actually 10 more points per game wouldn't have made that big of a difference. And if you want to start thinking about, well, how does Georgia compare, at least on paper, before the season begins, to a lot of its opponents for this upcoming season, I think what you realize is that Georgia's actually in a pretty enviable position right now. The FanDuel online sports book, not available in Georgia, but available in certain states, has gotten some early look-ahead lines out there for some of Georgia's top games. And they released some lines last week. They only had the one Georgia game. They've come back with a re-release now. You've got some more Georgia games who are out there. So if you kind of wonder how Georgia looks, and these are the only games that are available. So the Mississippi State game's not out there. Some of the higher profile Georgia games still not announced. Mississippi State may be the one you're the most interested in, because that may be the one game where Georgia has a chance of being less than a 10-point favorite. But how about Georgia against Oregon? A lot of hype right now around that game in Atlanta. Oregon's a recognized brand, obviously a head coach in Dan Lanning that UGA fans know well. But as we told you last week, Georgia's still expected to win easily, 16.5-point favorite right now over the Ducks. How about Georgia in Jacksonville against Florida? A lot of Florida fans think, maybe Billy Napier kind of gets that series, back a little bit more even again. Well, not this year, apparently, at least according to FanDuel. Georgia stands right now as an early 17-point favorite against Florida. How about the game in which a lot of folks seem to have circled for UGA because of how much Josh Heupel has done at Tennessee, and they're supposed to be preseason top 25 type team, and, obviously dangerous because of how prolific the offense can be. But as it stands right now in Athens, coming up this season, Georgia, 17.5-point favorite there against the Vols. Remember last week on the show, we had the audio from Vince Marrow, the Kentucky assistant, who was talking about his belief that, I know we weren't quite ready for that big showdown against Georgia in 2018. We could have won the East that day, but Georgia blew us out. But man, last year, that game in Athens led him to believe that Kentucky is just right there on the doorstep of being able to pull an upset of UGA. Well, FanDuel, the sports book, doesn't seem to think that. On the road, despite the fact that Georgia did not cover the last time it was in Lexington, on the road, Georgia stands right now as a 16-point favorite against the Wildcats. And then Georgia also a 28-point favorite against Georgia Tech, for what that's worth. So no line yet for South Carolina, no line yet for Mississippi State from FanDuel. Golden Nugget and Circuit, some of those sports books in Nevada, will have some releases coming up on this pretty soon. But for some of the games that a lot of Georgia fans are probably more interested in than any other, Georgia stands right now as a huge favorite in almost every single one of those games. Now listen, that doesn't guarantee anything. Georgia was a big favorite, almost 3 touchdowns a couple of years ago, and lost outright to South Carolina. So essentially anything is kind of possible. But when you look at the strength that Georgia is perceived to have going into the season, this is why so many people are starting to come to the realization, I believe correctly so, that Georgia has an inside track at being 12-0 again in the regular season, being very much in the college football playoff and national championship conversation once the month of December begins. This is a Georgia team right now very much in the thick of all of that, expected to coast through almost every regular season game that it's playing. Georgia, the reigning national champs, coming back for another year and still, for the most part, the envy of most all of college football. All right, we'll wrap up here with a couple of golden shoes. I enjoyed both of these. By the way, speaking of Georgia and its odds to win some of those regular season games, a lot of folks kind of putting their money where their mouth is, including our first golden shoe winner today. How about Greg Hendricks checking in from the Ari out there in Las Vegas, throwing down $20 on Georgia win the national championship at just 2.5 to 1 odds. You talk about short odds for Georgia in the national championship right now, just 2.5 to 1. But nonetheless, you love the idea of Greg Hendricks saying, I'm in Las Vegas, I'm having a good time, and boom, I'm putting my money down on the Dogs. That ticket cashed last year. Boy, I'd love to see that cash once again. So good stuff from Greg there on that. Also very funny here. So we talked yesterday about the weird rumor that popped up over the weekend that Dan Mullen might be an offensive coordinator at a very small school in Georgia, high school. So Sundog checks in to say, I think he's got a job. Maybe he's got a job. And then it shows Lake Oconee Academy's new assistant to the offensive coordinator. Now, if you're not watching on video, you don't see this. This is kind of an amalgam here of Dwight Schrute and Dan Mullen. This is maybe the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. Something about the combination of Schrute and Mullen here is really, really pretty horrifying, but also very funny on the part of Sundog there as well. We'll give him a golden shoe there too. We'll also remind you, Gator Hater Updater, speaking of those lousy, stinking Gators, it's now been a long time since they've won a national championship. How about 4,000? How many days has it been? Let's see, 4,000 and... quite a long time since Florida's won a national championship. Yeah, about 4,877 days. And more bad news coming for the lousy, stinking Gators in Jacksonville. 165 days from right now. Georgia getting another win. We love the idea of that. We appreciate you being here for DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We will see you back here again tomorrow. And on video time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. That is what R.S. Andrews does for you. What do you say we dive in, get some comments here? I hope everybody's doing really well. And I guess we're having a little bit of an issue with DawgNation.com right now. Is that correct? So we're going to work to get that fixed. So if you've... Oh, it's fixed now. All right, well, there you go. So there you go. Glad I could be of service. So it was an issue, but now it's back, and so everybody's happy. So with that in mind, we'll check you out over here and see how you're doing on the YouTube side of things. All right. What's going on YouTube? They're always arguing about something. It always takes me a second to even figure out what the topic of conversation is over here. Paul Moon on the subject of Anthony Richardson. Yeah, listen, that's a good-looking quarterback prospect. We'll see how he kind of puts it together. It is interesting, I think, that right now, Billy Napier is showing a little more confidence in Richardson than Dan Mullen ever seemed willing to show, and maybe that's for the better. I mean, there is a chance, y'all, that Mullen just didn't do right by Richardson a year ago, that kept trying to kind of go back down the Emory Jones route, even though it was obvious that wasn't going to work. I mean, listen, we don't obviously like to make fun of Florida, and, I think a lot of us have seen quarterbacks hyped up during the offseason, and, that proves to be a little bit silly in some cases. But there's also the possibility this is who Florida should have been riding with at quarterback all the time. And maybe this is Napier correcting one of the errors that Dan Mullen had made. Let's see what else. Zebulon Owen says the only game I'm worried about for Georgia this upcoming season is the real USC. He means South Carolina on that. Yeah, I mean, I understand where you're coming from, and then obviously, against Spencer Rattler in his own stadium, that could be a tricky game. But I would still say, and this kind of flies in the face of us laughing at Vince Merrill last week, I'd still say the road game at Kentucky I expect to be a little tougher. Historically speaking, it kind of has been. Georgia hasn't always played great against the Wildcats in general, but on the road at Kentucky, they've had their issues every now and then. The thing in 2020 was certainly not a thing of beauty. I would say at Mississippi State has the potential to be a little bit of a challenge for UGA there as well. But if you're looking for a spot where it happens, where Georgia gets tested maybe more than some folks think it's going to, one of those 3 true road games is most certainly the answer to that question. Let us see what else. DSA1 says, what are you going to say when Georgia embarrasses people again this year? I bet a lot of these fans are going to become Casper the Ghost. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of goalpost moving going on right now with, Georgia, the reigning national champion. Folks are trying to get those jabs in at UGA while they still can, because if Georgia comes back and does it again, then all that stuff is just so passe that you can't even begin to come out and do it anymore. And there are a lot of folks who've built a lot of their identity around kind of making fun of Georgia. That's become the program they like to kick around, and they know that the shelf life on that's getting pretty close to reaching its expiration date. They know that, and so they're trying to get it in while they still can. At least that's the sense that I get. Let's see what else. G. Gray Spammer Boy right in the middle of this, as always. Kirby's Visor says rival fans are tryhards. There is an element to which that you do have to try a little hard to come after Georgia these days, I'd say. It is not as easy as maybe it once was. And listen, I think one of the hardest things for like a rival Georgia fan is that, Georgia fans for the most part have kind of called their shot on this. Like they saw the early evidence from Kirby Smart and saying he's going to get there eventually. It may not happen this year, it may not happen, 12 months from now. But Kirby Smart's going to get there, and he's getting there sooner rather than later. This was Georgia fans kind of calling their shot on this. It was, in retrospect, it was obvious that this is where things were heading, that Kirby was building it quickly. And I've said before that in retrospect, it's not a situation where, gosh, it took Kirby 6 years to do this. No, in retrospect, it's amazing that it happened so fast for a rookie head coach, unlocking all the potential that Georgia had as quickly as he did. It's amazing the speed with which this occurred, not the fact that it took a little longer than it's supposed to, because Kirby was a rookie head coach when he sat in this chair for the very first time, and look where things are now. So important to keep that in mind. On Facebook for a couple of minutes here. Hope everyone's doing well over there. Great to be back in studio here today. Jamie Huff says moving the goalpost is what fans do, ours as well as the other team's fans. Yeah, that's certainly true, is that, listen, some of the same things that, we might accuse opposing fan bases of doing, Georgia fans themselves can maybe be found having done in the past. That's not incorrect. But that's also kind of what makes the college football conversation fun. Sandy Price says the number one stat is winning. The rest is what it is. Defense, offense, whatever else just comes down to winning, and Sandy, I believe, is right about that. Carter Lawson also checks in to say, I have no doubt that there are many people in California and many other states who would love to kill college football. I wish that weren't true. I hope it's not, but I can't prove that it isn't. If you've got the LA Times, I don't want to say the LA Times is celebrating this. They're just, they're just stating it emphatically. This would be the knockout blow for college athletics. Like, why would you want to knock out college athletics? Why would you want to? Like, what do you gain by that? I believe, and I'm going to be on a soapbox for like 5 seconds here, there's a huge segment of our population who thinks that tearing something down is the same thing as building something, and it's not. It does not take a hero to tear down college athletics. You could do it. If you pick and pull at it enough, the bonds that hold it together, you can disassemble them. But tearing it down is not the same thing as building something, an institution that serves as many people as college athletics has. And that's the problem, is that this sort of feels similar to a lot of other things in life where you come in here and you say, well, this isn't perfect, so therefore let's demolish it. And then it's just left in ruin, left in smoldering embers, and there's nothing rebuilt to replace it. Because trust me when I tell you, the people who think they're clever enough to destroy it would find out they are nowhere near clever enough to build something back up that works as well as this has for more than a century. And that's what all this comes down to. Joe Maley says that if Kirby didn't get a Gatorade bath, is he really a champion? Well, here's the thing to know. At Georgia, there will be no Gatorade baths. You may have a sports drink bath. You may have I'll give a free plug to Powerade. You may have a Powerade bath. But there will be no Gator anything on the skin of or the mouths of any Georgia players. At least hope not, anyway. Keith Fold says, I can't believe the pricing for the Oregon game in the bins. As someone who has certainly bought my fair share of tickets over the years, I'm a big believer that tickets are always very high early on the process. We're still several months away here. So let's get a little closer to the start of the game and let's see if we see a little stabilization. Because remember, I mean, listen, don't take my word on this. You got to do your own research on this. But this is not Georgia playing Alabama, Georgia playing Clemson, Georgia playing one of these teams that's in the same region. This is Georgia playing Oregon. Now, there may just be enough Georgia fans who want to fill the stadium, but the lack of push from like a in-region opponent, that ought to soften up the ticket market a little bit, I would guess. I mean, there's not going to be 8 million Oregon fans in that stadium. They're just not. It's a long way to travel. Oregon's not as big a fan base as people realize. So my guess is the absence of an in-region opponent ought to soften up the market eventually a little bit, but maybe there's just so much interest in Georgia that doesn't necessarily happen. But if I had to guess, maybe you get a little bit of a break on that at some point in time. Matt Rukavina checks in to say, I think we can all agree that listening to anyone from maybe so. Certainly when it comes to college sports, the folks in California seem to have some interesting ideas. Greg Childer says, I believe that Josh Heupel's doing a good job, and 5-7 isn't the expectation. He took over UCF. They dropped down severely once he took over from Frost. Yeah, it's true that he's actually facing a little bit better outlook at Tennessee right now than he was facing while he was at UCF. He's clearly recruiting a little bit better than he was in Orlando. So maybe that's the case. I still think, though, the issue is, there are a lot of people last year who thought that Tennessee played a little over its head defensively for all the attention that Josh Heupel's offense got. It's a little bit of a tricky offense, more spread out, playing faster than even sort of fast spread type teams do. They are just a little bit more of a sort of extreme version of that. But I think for a lot of, I'm talking about coaches and people like that I heard from, that they actually really felt like that Tennessee kind of played way better defensively than it had a right to because of all the defensive talent it had lost once Jeremy Pruitt left the program. So, does that mean that can that be sustained here for the upcoming year? Because ultimately, if Tennessee's a true top 25 type team, if it's a true, SEC East, eventual contender type team, you got to find that complementary balance. You got to find a little bit on both sides of the ball on that. Connor Riley checking in here for a minute.
And I'll say this about Heupel's time at Tennessee, at Central Florida. Part of the reason they regressed every year, obviously there were concerns about recruiting that. It seems like Heupel has answered. But that offense is so unique that I think this year you saw it really just blow people away how fast it is. And if you're not prepared for it, it can really catch up on you. And I think Georgia did a good job of knowing during its bye week, we're going to have to put in some extra install for this. It's a little like the triple option in the sense that I think once teams see this on a more annual basis and sort of have a better idea of what to expect, that offense might not be as dynamic as you think it is, as it currently looks to be right now.
I think that's exactly right. I've had smart people tell me it is the fastest offense in college football. That everybody's trying to play fast. No one plays faster than the Heupel teams do. And obviously, if you watch them, and you may have to be in the stadium to kind of tell like how spread they are. They are spread out beyond the numbers, almost exactly to the sideline. For the most part, no one is that spread out with their spread. And so Connor, I think, says it right. So it's a unique offense in the truest sense of the definition, that no one else really quite does it that way. But once you've seen it a couple times, do you have a little bit more of a recipe for stopping it? I think that's probably about right. One or two more comments we got to go for today. Wendell LaRue checking in on the conversation here. Moose Tame's there as well. They're kind of going back and forth with each other a little bit, having a conversation. Kent Holcomb on the subject of the couple buying some windows yesterday. Yeah, the folks there at Pella Window and Door of Georgia were well taken care of and came away with some very happy new products, so that's great to see. Hugh Nash also checks in to say that my solution is to allow NIL deals when a player has played a full college season. Also, if a player transfers, they forfeit their NIL deal and minimize the portal time frame. He says, problem solved, college football saved. He says, you are welcome, and he tips his hat. So there you go, Hugh. So that's obviously, I think, what the powers that be would like to do, some version of that. But can you do that without running afoul of the law? Some people say no. I think that some smart people are going to try to do it anyway. So we will see how it plays out. But I do like your suggestion, certainly for sure. All right, we'll come back. We'll do more comments tomorrow. We got to bounce for right now. But we appreciate you being here on our R.S. Andrews podcast. Cooled in. Also check out the Atlanta Journal-Constitution online, ajc.com. Braves lost a frustrating game in Milwaukee last night. Just can't find the offense right now. And striking out way too much, I would say. But getting ready to get back at it up there in Milwaukee a little bit later on. Also, Falcons going through rookie minicamp. Some good stuff from John Fitzpatrick and others there related to that. So check out the Atlanta Journal-Constitution online at ajc.com. Also, have a great day. I'll see you back here for R.S. Andrews Cool Down again tomorrow. Don't forget, if your water heater goes out, in many cases, R.S. Andrews can replace it the same day. Just got to find them online at rsandrews.com. And DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Back tomorrow morning, 9:45 for our First and 15. 10 a.m. after that on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. We'll look forward to seeing you then. Podcast, everything else after that. Have a great day, everybody.